So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Professor Nicholas Vargas. I'm an associate professor in Chicanx Latinx Studies and the Department of Ethnic Studies, and I'm serving as this year's faculty organizer for the Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration Colloquium series here for the Institute for Governmental Studies. And before I begin, I want to offer a sincere thank you to the IGS staff, especially Mary Watson, Ezra Bristow, for all of their work organizing today's visit and talk. Let's please give them a round of applause. Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Irene Vega, Associate Professor of Sociology at UC Irvine. Professor Vega's scholarship examines immigration enforcement and immigration control and how those systems shape the lives of migrants and their descendants. Her ongoing research also explores experiences of upward social mobility across racialized groups in California. But today she's here to share research from her recently published book, Bordering on Indifference, Immigration Agents Negotiating Race and Morality, from Princeton University Press. And as the book takes up, there's no shortage of news, right, about the Border Patrol and ICE, but most of us know far less about the agents themselves, who they are, how they come into this work, how they're trained, and how they navigated the political dimensions, racial inequities, and moral ambiguities built into immigration enforcement. This book is based on interviews with immigration agents, most of them Latinas and Latinos, and at its core, it's about the normalization of exclusion and the institutional production of indifference. The institutional production of indifference that's both taught as a bureaucratic strategy for looking away from some of the most conflicting aspects of their jobs, and also cultivated through agents' efforts to maintain a moral sense of self. So Professor Vega, we're genuinely grateful you're here today for sharing your work with our community. We're going to hold questions until the end, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A afterwards. Yeah? So let's welcome Professor Vega.
Thank you so much, Professor Vargas, for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you also for Mary and Ezra for all of the organizational work that came into bringing us here together. It's a really it's a pleasure to be here with you all today on this beautiful but humid day. Unless lest you be used to the humidity. It's very humid. And hello to everyone who's online as well. Today I'll be talking about my book, Bordering on Indifference, Immigration Agents Negotiating Race and Morality. As Professor Vargas mentioned, we can get through to okay, there we go. This book is the product of my research with immigration enforcement agents, both U.S. Border Patrol agents pictured here in green, and ICE deportation officers pictured here in blue. So over the course of 2 years, I interviewed 90 immigration enforcement agents. Most of them were Latinos. Most of them were either children of immigrants themselves, and then there were some children of immigrants. And the majority of them had grown up along the US-Mexico border that they were then policing. So some of you may know that these U.S. immigration bureaucracies are considered, or what the Tomás Rivera Policy Institute called in 2007, ethnic enclaves of Hispanic employment in the U.S. federal government. So somewhat ironically, the Department of Homeland Security is actually seen as a diversity leader in the federal government for its success in hiring minoritized people. Primarily Hispanics or Latinos. So today, 51% of the Border Patrol are Hispanic or Latinos. 1/3 of the deportation arm of ICE, so enforcement and removal operations, are Hispanics. And this percentage is much higher along the Southwest border, where about 75% or more of the agents stationed there can be Hispanics or Latinos, and I'll talk about why that is. So in the book, I elaborate the paradoxical combinations of both social control and social mobility that the immigration state creates in border towns throughout the Southwest. But at its core, as Professor Vargas mentioned, my analysis is about the normalization of exclusion and about the production of indifference in institutions like the U.S. immigration system. And I argue that indifference, which we can understand most simply as apathy or detachment, is both a taught bureaucratic strategy that agents use to look away from the most morally dubious aspects of their work, as well as a major product of their efforts to cultivate a moral sense of self. So overall, I argue that indifference is one of the normative mechanisms that protects the status quo in US immigration agencies. In terms of the book's narrative approach, and it sounds like some of you have already read the book, so you know that what I try to do is take the reader through a somewhat processual account that shows how immigration agents come into the work, how they're trained and socialized to do the job, how that training and socialization shapes the way they recognize, but also reconcile the political dimensions, racial inequities, and moral ambiguities of the work. And especially thinking about graduate students, I wrote an extensive methodological appendix where I try to kind of draw out both how I got access to these agencies, which is actually changing. I can talk about access for hours during the Q&A, but how I got access to these agencies, but also talking about some of the power dynamics that are inherent to studying organizational elites and hard to reach populations that are hard to reach, not because they're in precarity, but because they have power in organizational gatekeeping resources to keep researchers out. Today, I'm going to talk about chapter 4, which is about denial. But before I go any further, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the moment that we're in. So over the course of this year, I've had an opportunity to think about what it means to publish a book about immigration agents during this particular time in history. And specifically, I've been asking myself, what does a book about bureaucratic indifference contribute during a time of heightened repression through immigration enforcement? And the thought that I keep coming back to is that indifference is how we get here. Indifference aggregated over time across people, inscribed into law, and propagated through politics is what sets the context for the atrocities that we've witnessed, that we're witnessing right now. And so when I think about it in those terms, I'm reminded that what we're seeing isn't new, it's new in other places, right? So Kelly Lytle Hernandez's seminal history of the organization of the Border Patrol showed, that the racial violence of the immigration state has long been on display along the US-Mexico border. But right now it's on display for many more of us to see and to hopefully not look away from. So my goal is that after reading this book, you'll have a better understanding of how we got here, but also how those actions that seem confusing, at least, but really outrageous to many of us outside of these organizations can be taken for granted as not just normal, but also correct, right? Not just the way things are, but the way things ought to be. And I think a really good entry point to understand that normalization is the experience of someone who I call Marcos Bayan. And this was the first immigration agent that I spoke to for this book. And again, if you've read the book, you know that this is familiar to you because it comes from the introduction. And so Marcos and I, this is not Marcos, by the way. None of the pictures that I'm going to show you are of my actual respondents. So we did not know each other, but we shared a mutual friend, and Marcos had begrudgingly agreed to do them a favor by talking to me. And so I had never seen Marcos before, but when he walked into the coffee shop where we had agreed to meet, I knew he was my respondent right away because he was wearing a green t-shirt that was just a shade lighter than the Border Patrol uniform that you see here. He had short black hair, very thick, it was straight and kind of neatly combed to the side. His skin was a rich brown. And I later learned that he was in his early 30s, but that day he looked older to me, probably because he didn't want to be there. He had come from a long shift and he didn't want to talk to a researcher about his work. And understanding that, I got straight to the point. I said, I'm trying to understand immigration enforcement by talking to immigration agents, but I've had a really hard time getting access to agents. And all I need is for you to kind of let me know, how do I get people to talk to me? And Marcos was not optimistic that I would be able to pull this off. He said, agents are really private about their job. I don't even like wearing this shirt right now, but I just got off work. And I said, what's wrong with the shirt? He said, it makes me look like a Border Patrol agent. I had the same reaction. I started to laugh because, of course, he was a Border Patrol agent, and that's why we were talking that day. But he flashed me a cautious smile and explained that the agency didn't have the best reputation around here, and people just think we're dream crushers. Now, this was exactly what I wanted to talk to him about, so I tried to probe, but he was done with that part of the conversation. And so we transitioned to talking about access. And so months later, in part because of how emphatic Marcos had been that no one would talk to me if I didn't get official permission from the Border Patrol sector headquarters, I ultimately did that. And I was able to get access. And the next time I talked to him was that fall, and kind of surprised that I had gotten access, but also clearly pleased, he invited me into his home for the interview. And so Marcos lived, also not his house, in a sprawling ranch-style house that was only a few years old and located in this solidly upper middle-class neighborhood. He had a nice, really relatively new, shiny truck in the driveway, a tastefully furnished living room, a very large and welcoming Southwestern-style backyard. And Marcos told me that he was really proud of the life that he had built with the Border Patrol job, even though he hadn't always been sure that he could do this job. Because in fact, Marcos's father and his grandfather had both come to the United States without documentation decades apart. Both of them wanted to have a better life and decided that going to the States was the way to do it, is how he described it to me. And so when Marcos was considering doing this job, he thought, I have to seek my father's blessing. I'll only do it if my dad says that it's okay. And so he says, I talked to my dad about it, and he said, look, there's always going to be someone there, whether it be you or someone who is racist. Why not it be somebody like you that actually knows what a lot of these people are going through? And Marcos thinks, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. And so what made a lot of sense to Marcos was the unspoken promise of his racial, ethnic, and immigrant background. It was the assumption that he, the son and grandson of a formerly undocumented Mexican immigrants, could somehow be a force of good within an agency known for being bad. So in fact, Marcos told me that he had been, quote, a little anti-Border Patrol growing up, but somewhere along the line, he learned that this agency was a viable employment option for someone like him, a bilingual high school graduate with a clean criminal record and the desire to move up in the world. It was really a no-brainer in terms of economic mobility. And so to contextualize Marcos's experience, it's important to understand that in the predominantly Mexican border towns of the Southwest, carceral institutions are omnipresent, both as a source of menace and as a source of opportunity. In fact, in the two towns that I studied in Arizona and California, protective services occupations, which is a federal occupational category that captures correctional officers, law enforcement officers like sheriffs, local state law enforcement, private security, occupations. These kinds of occupations are 2 to 3 times more common along the Southwest border than in the rest of the United States. I would actually think these are now outdated. It's probably even higher with the extensive proliferation of immigration detention centers in these towns. And so this concentration of law enforcement jobs isn't surprising if you know that prisons tend to be sited in small towns and rural communities with higher than average levels of poverty and racial minorities and lower than average levels of education. And so this accurately describes many places along the US-Mexico border, as well as many places here in California, right? Think of the Central Valley. And so Marcos's rather instrumental pathway into the profession leads to a police training program that teaches this intense sense of mission, It teaches agents that they are the good guys that are engaged in this morally righteous battle with a variety of bad guys. And, I just want to take a moment here to mention there's actually a really interesting documentary called At the Ready that I was not involved with, but it basically features these Latino high school students in their pathway into law enforcement professions. And it really captures the experiences of many of the people that I interviewed. And Cristina Beltran, who's a political scientist, has also written about how the extensive recruitment of Latinos into law enforcement professions has changed the politics of the border, which we saw in this last election. And so we can see that transformation in Marcos Payan just 10 years into the work. When I talked to him, he held two somewhat conflicting views of immigrants. He conceded that not all immigrants were criminals. He told me a great majority of people are just people trying to live, trying to work, and I get that because of my roots. But that economic understanding of migration now stood alongside deep convictions about the importance of enforcement. Marcos thought that it wasn't economic migrants like his father or grandfather that were the issue. It was the cunning terrorists that he had learned about, the unscrupulous smugglers, the violent drug traffickers. They were the ones that he worried about, and he figured that he just had to catch all of them in order to find the worst of them. So in the end, Marcos had acquired the bureaucratic personality that allowed him to understand his job as narrow and straightforward. His job was just to apprehend people who didn't have permission to be in the US. It wasn't his job to decipher between good immigrants and bad immigrants, and he had learned that many of them were, quote, liars and, quote, full of shit anyway. So it was really impossible to know who they were without fingerprinting them. And in order to fingerprint them, well, you had to arrest them first. And then you would call someone else to transport them to the processing station. And once at the processing station, it was a different agent's job to put those, quote, bodies through a legal process that was designed by someone way above all of their pay grades. It was the system, not Marcos, that would sort and process those bodies according to law and policy written by people that Marcos reasoned knew a lot more than he did. At the end of his shift, Marcos would get in his truck, he would rest in his well-appointed home, and he would repeat it all the next day. Yes, he could relate to immigrants because of his roots, as he put it, but that didn't stop him from doing his job. So the experience of Marcos Payan captures how one agent who came into the job for rather instrumental purposes and with some ambivalence about the role that he could play in these immigration agencies, how this person thought about their work 10 years into the job. And in the book, you meet a lot of agents like Marcos Payan, but in the end, the book is not really about agents as individuals, nor is it just about how they grapple with uncertainty. This book is about the moral economy of immigration control, those effective and evaluative principles that are mobilized in relation to migrants and immigration. These principles circulate in public space, through politics and bureaucratic process, and through legal process. And they create the common sense principles that agents use to evaluate and make sense of their role. And I argue that indifference is a really important part of that moral economy, and that thinking about indifference is really important, especially during this time. Because yes, as we've seen in Minneapolis most recently, but we've seen in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and we've long seen along the US-Mexico border, immigration control is an inherently coercive form of state power that trades in spectacle, but it's also carried out routinely under the guise of legal and technical bureaucratic rationality, right? So thinking about indifference allows us to square the spectacle of immigration control with its slow violence counterpart. So that's the book overall. And what I want to do now is kind of zoom in on one chapter to show you what I mean about how indifference is produced. And so I want to talk about denial as part of that process. So denial is commonly understood as a refusal to admit the truth or to accept some unpleasant reality. But denial isn't just a psychological response to discomfort. The sociology of denial is concerned with how collective, organized, and official forms of denial maintain structural inequities and protect perpetrators and witnesses from accountability for harmful acts that happen on behalf of the state. And so organizations like the US immigration bureaucracy invest a great deal of resources in elaborate myths and ideologies that justify their existence, but also give their agents license to do harm on behalf of the state. And so denial is a part of that process. And in chapter 4, I zoom in on how agents use denial to look away from human suffering as they do the work. And what I'm interested in this chapter are in specific instances of moral ambiguities. The way that I'm defining moral ambiguities in this chapter are specific stories where agents were uncertain about the rightness of their actions, or where they were aware in telling me those stories that others would see their actions as wrong, even if legal. And so what I did is I coded for what scholars call moral emotions, like sympathy, words like felt bad, feel bad, empathy, shame, embarrassed. And I look at where those words appear in my interviews with agents. I draw out those stories, and then I see what happens after. And that's where we see denial coming to the fore. And so what I found through that process is that agents engage in 3 forms of denial. They deny responsibility by relying on the power and morality of law. They deny harm by recasting their work as not hurting immigrants, and sometimes even going as far as to say they're helping immigrants. And they deny the victim by implicating immigrants in their own suffering. And what these strategies allow agents to do is to do away with inconvenient moral emotions that could usually create the instinct that would lead to refusal, right? If you're experiencing shame about something, whether it's your job or whether it's something else, the instinct is to stop doing that thing. If you feel really bad for someone, the instinct is to help. What we see is that they turn to denial and then continue with an uncritical performance of the work. Now, if you're familiar with Sykes and Matza's neutralization techniques, these strategies are familiar to you because Stanley Cohen, in identifying these denial strategies, drew on Sykes and Matza's work. And so these are essentially neutralization techniques. And what neutralization techniques do is to make deviant behavior possible, right? So what I want to do with the rest of my time is demonstrate how a denial appears in these specific stories. And the way that I'll do that is I'm going to tell you about the specific stories that agents told me. I'll show you the denial strategies that come after, and then I can kind of discuss what that means for the broader project. And I have to issue a warning that many of these stories feature difficult themes like family separation. The first strategy of denial that I want to illustrate is denial of responsibility. And in this strategy, agents frame themselves as powerless implementers of an authority more powerful than them, right? So the authority is often the law, but it can also be a list of names that was handed to them. It could be their supervisor. It could be the decisions that came before them. And I'll illustrate how this works through the experience of someone who I call Sam Huey. So Sam Hugh was a tall Black man, a deportation officer who I met at a local jail. And then I described in the book kind of being taken aback by his attire, because where I was accustomed to seeing ICE deportation officers wearing jeans or khaki pants, cargo pants, and kind of combat boots, and black ICE polos, Sam Hugh was wearing was wearing like what I associated with like a golfer's outfit, or more like business casual. He had a dark gray polo, dress shoes, and black slacks. And he was fully, in business casual in this jail. He kind of stood out. And Sam Hugh told me a lot of stories about his job. Many of these stories reflected how he wanted to be seen, right? It was him telling me stories about him doing a difficult job in the best way that he could. But one of the stories that he told me was different from those other stories. It was a time that it was his job to pry a preschool age child from their grandmother as they clung to each other, sobbing and screaming. The child and the grandmother had crossed between ports of entry in Arizona and had claimed asylum. They turned themselves into the Border Patrol and claimed asylum. But they were not treated as a family unit, which would have allowed them to stay together. But no one told the mother and the grandmother, no one told the grandmother that they would not be treated as a family unit. And so they were transported from Arizona to California together, where it was his job, Sam Hugh's job, to physically separate the child from the grandmother so that the legal process could continue, which agent or Officer Hugh did. And so when he told me about this, he says, "I'm ashamed." Now I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking, wow, I think we could have did better than that. But once they ran it up their chain of command, it's out of my hands. But if they had called us and said, "This is the situation," I could have said, "Hey, let's just process them as a family unit." Simple as that. But that was a person that was doing their job. And he stared at me and said, "I can still see the grandmother." Now, you can see here Officer Hugh communicating this sense of shame. He even said, he told me when he was telling me the story, why do you even want to end on this note? Because this was toward the end of our interview. And I said, "I don't want to end on this note." He said that, and that's when he said, and he said, "I don't want you to include that." And I said, "Okay, you want me to redact that story?" He said, no, I don't want you to do that. I'm ashamed. And this is where, you see this happening. Now, you see Officer Hugh communicating this sense of shame, but then relying on the chain of command to explain that actually he was just powerless to the decisions that occurred before him. So in this sense, Officer Hugh is not directly responsible for this act because he was following orders from someone else. Now, it's really common for policy implementers to limit their responsibility for unfavorable outcomes by denying discretion and imposing certain restrictions on their own power, right? Everybody has experienced the dreaded, like, "Hey, I don't make the rules. That's not my job. I'm just doing my job." Some of you, if you're faculty or students that work with undergrads, might have said, "Hey, look at the syllabus. It's not me, it's the syllabus," right? And now that's really common. So in this way, immigration agents like Officer Hugh are one case in a larger universe of street level bureaucrats or policy implementers using rules and regulations to distance themselves from unpopular decisions at work. But of course, where they're different is that immigration agents' work is particularly coercive and morally charged, right? Their work is, in this case, to forcibly separate a preschool age child from their only caretaker so that a legal process can continue. The stakes are very, very high, very, very different. So in this case, denial allows Officer Hugh to protect his moral sense of self, to say, it wasn't my responsibility, it wasn't my call. Had I had more power, I would have done something differently, which allows him to make peace with that act and do away with the uncertainty that could have led to refusal, right? That's what moral emotions do. And so he does away with those inconvenient emotions and is able to do his job uncritically. That's denial of responsibility. The second strategy is denial of harm, where instead of agents framing themselves as powerless to the law that causes human suffering or someone else, they kind of downplay that suffering and sometimes even frame their work as helping agents do away with suffering. Now, the experience of Border Patrol Wilfredo Escarra is an example of the downplaying strategy. So officer or agent Estrada was the son of Mexican immigrants who was working as a Border Patrol agent in his hometown. And he told me that the first time that he arrested someone, he felt a big surge of guilt. He remembered thinking, oh man, I feel horrible about it. Now, Agent Escarra actually was surprised about this because he had made a bet with his colleagues who were part of his field training unit, which is the last part of training that agents get before they go out and do their work on their own. And the bet had been that he would be the first one to arrest someone on his own. And so Wilfredo actually won the bet. And so he thought that he would be excited, but what he experienced and said was guilt. And that was because he said it was someone who had come to the US for work, just like his own family had done over the years. And he remembers, he tells me, I was thinking like, oh, what am I doing? These are my own people. If my parents hadn't gotten away, I wouldn't be able to do this, right? He's sort of going through this. But when faced with this regret, Agent Escarra turns to the denial of harm. So he reminds himself that he wasn't really doing anything bad to them. He was simply taking them back to the station where somebody was going to process them and they were just going to go back to their home country. And they would probably try again later and they would probably get away. So he says, I didn't crush their dreams. It's just they're being held back just a little bit, right? So this is a denial of harm through downplaying, right? As we know, the implications of being arrested by the Border Patrol are not just a little setback. They're very serious. And so another situation that shows the denial of harm, this time not through a downplaying of that harm, but through a reframing of their work as helping. Now, I'm going to try to explain this because it's sort of in the weeds, right? It's hard to follow. So Officer Andrea Lopez, ICE Officer Andrea Lopez, told me about the time that it was her job to deport an elderly woman. She was in her 70s. And it so happened that the deportation was around Christmas time. And so when they arrived at the woman's house, the woman was making tamales. She says she had the masa, she had the carne, she had the vegetables. She's like, you could smell the food. And she said in that moment, like, this could have been my mom. And she said, this could have been your mom. I felt like lightning would strike me. She's like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? So how she responds is this. Look, there's some denial of responsibility in ICE Officer Lopez's account. She explained to the woman, your case is done. The appeals didn't work. The judge ordered you removed, right? So she's explaining, I'm powerless to reverse the decisions of someone else. But the way that she frames the deportation as an effort to help the woman is what identifies this as a denial of harm by reframing. So she told the woman, and she's like explaining it to me that she was trying to be very both intentional about how she explained this to the woman, but also subtle, right? She said, look, ma'am, your case is open. Until we take you back to Mexico, we'll continue coming back. but once the case is closed, we don't even know who you are. If she came back, she says, so basically the deportation is a strategy to help you get ICE off your back. Once we deport you, you can come back and we don't even know that you're here. She says she probably came back to finish the tamales. If she came back or not, I don't know. I don't care. That case was closed for us. I felt so bad. I felt so bad. It just killed me because we're human after all. So the examples that I've given to you so far are of agents implicitly conceding to the suffering created by their role, sometimes explicitly, as immigration law implementers, especially in relation to people that they felt sympathy for, and then explaining that they were either powerless to do anything different or recasting their work as helping or downplaying of that harm. In the final denial strategy, you see agents dealing with very similar situations in a very different way through justification. The agents that engage in this form of denial are mostly white, and they negate sympathy instead of framing themselves and instead frame themselves as righteous deliverers of a merited punishment. So denial of the victim is the third strategy of denial. You can see this through the experience of ICE officer Shane Klatt. So ICE officer Klatt was an interesting character. He was nearing retirement. He had a very dark sense of humor. I interviewed Officer Klatt a few times. And each time it was sort of very matter of fact, the way that he explained his work. But in this case, he told me about the time that his job was to deport a man, and it was early in the morning. And it turned out that his target was walking his two little girls to school. And Officer Klatt remembered the two pink backpacks very vividly. Now, of course, he told me we would have preferred that the children not be around, but it wasn't as if we could come back at a better time. There really wasn't a better time. And so they said, we won't handcuff him for the girls' sake. Now, when he was telling me this, Officer Klatt told me that he could empathize with the family's situation, but he did not go as far as to, quote, feel bad. He doesn't deny his responsibility for the deportation, nor does he try to downplay that harm. Instead, he says, hey, this guy had it coming. This was just a punishment that would have happened eventually, a merited punishment, and I just happened to be the one who issued the punishment. So he says, at the end of the day, guess what? You were the one who didn't go to court. You came here illegally. You got caught. You got called on your bullshit. You put yourself in that situation. I don't go physically down to Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Brazil, grab somebody and go, here you go. Establish yourself here. Go have kids so I can remove you. As soon as you get comfortable with that shit, I'm going to go pick you up and send you out here. We don't do that. They are the ones that make that decision. Now, a couple of things about this strategy. You see that when agents take on the role of a punisher, this merited punishment, it is Latin American immigrants who they see themselves punishing, right? So it's no coincidence that the countries that he rattles off are the countries that have the highest rates of deportation from the United States and disproportionately high rates of deportation, right? That aren't reflective of the actual population size. And so kind of free of the moral reprobation, this racialized moral reprobation that immigration agents who are Latinos, who are of immigrant background, free of that kind of reprobation that they get, whites in my sample were the ones that were more free to adopt this role. Especially in relation to an interviewer that is of Latino background as well, right? So I want to acknowledge that. And we can talk about all of that during the Q&A. So we've discussed quite a bit here. Let me just take a moment to review. So these instances of moral ambiguity are gendered. So they almost always feature women, children, or families. Agents seldom experience the deportation of men as morally dubious. And that is because Latinx men are to the immigration state what Black men have long been to the carceral system, the symbolic assailant, right? That embodies the threat that they perceive themselves protecting against. Latinx agents tend to favor denial of harm and denial of responsibility, while white agents tend to favor the denial of the victim. And denial of harm and responsibility are explanations that involve admitting the act in question is bad, but trying to deny the act's pejorative connotation, whereas denial is a justification which denies the act's pejorative connotation. It's sort of in the weeds, but these are different kinds of rationalization techniques that have to do with race. And I argue that denial goes beyond coping. While agents' denial may emerge from the most basic human instinct to have a positive sense of self, it's not just that. As agents reconcile the moral ambiguities of their work by turning to denial, they repair the normative foundation, and that repair allows them to comply with their organizational mandates and continue with an uncritical performance of their work, even under times of uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that might lead to refusal. And so I also want to make clear that these stories are far from idiosyncratic. Rather, they are pattern and reflect both bureaucratic ideologies that deny harm and scale up to organizational denial that permits the status quo to continue. So in short, these denial strategies make bureaucratic indifference impossible by lulling an instinct to go against mandates. And I can tell you how I came upon these stories during the Q&A, but I will say I didn't ask them for stories of moral ambiguity. I asked them for memorable stories, and these were some of the stories that came out. And so before we close, I just want to take a brief moment to reflect on the then and now, right? As a kind of setting the table for our discussion. First, the entire country has become much more polarized since I finished my fieldwork. So you can see the numbers there. But it isn't just that we disagree more with each other. It's also that these disagreements are highly moralized. So people see members of the opposite party as more immoral, dishonest, lazy, and closed-minded. And this has shaped the way that we see immigrants and immigration, as well as who we have been willing to elect, and the likelihood of being able to agree on any sensible middle ground on immigration, whatever that means today, right? These political changes have been reflected in what's going on bureaucratically as well. Whereas during the Obama and Biden administrations, however imperfect, and they were very imperfect as with regards to immigration, at least there was this concerted effort to restrict and shape agents' discretion. During the Trump administration, all of those efforts to restrict and shape agents' discretion have gone away. And so what you see is an agency that is being guided by agencies' pro-enforcement culture, their policing culture, this highly militarized culture than ever before. You couple that with the longstanding issues with transparency and accountability, and with the agent leaders as well as political leaders signaling rhetorically and materially that the guardrails are off. And I think that's how you get to what we're seeing here all over the country, but most recently in Minneapolis. Now, another thing that's important to mention is how flush with money these agencies are. The enforcement arm of the immigration bureaucracy has always been more well-funded than the service arm or the courts, which is a big part of the issue. But that enforcement arm has now has, for example, a $75 billion allocation from the Big Beautiful Bill. So this whole idea of the government shutdown, really, it's not, they're really shielded from those efforts. I think they're important, but it's important to know that they're so flush with money that they can withstand even those efforts. 30 billion of that is for recruitment, hiring, and training of agents, which the government is conducting in outright ideological ways, and also has really downgraded the vetting and the training, right? So that's also different from when I was in the field. I also worry about there's important selection issues here. You know, the story that I tell you of Marcos Payan coming into the work for very instrumental reasons may be very different to who's coming into ICE and the Border Patrol today. If right now someone's like, that's where I want to be, that sounds really good. There's a very different process and selection issue into these agencies that I think we're going to be thinking about and worrying about for a really long time. And then, of course, the agents that I interviewed worked in border towns. They did immigration enforcement in border towns. They weren't doing urban policing. They weren't in urban cities dealing with peaceful protesters. I think when I see what's happening right now, I think these agents are simply out of their depth. They're undertrained for what they're doing. And frankly, I think, and also from talking to other policing scholars, they're bringing diluted training and this paramilitary culture and assumptions, which is also reflective of the broader policing profession, into these towns with really deadly consequences, as we've seen. So if I were writing this book today, I don't think that indifference would be in the title. I don't know what would be in the title, but I do think that indifference helps us understand the normative foundations of these agencies, the seeds that were planted, and how those seeds and that foundation were primed for the outright repression that we're seeing today. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much for listening. And Shameless plug, 30% off with that code. I'll leave it up.
You could do bordering on ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Bordering on a lot of things. Yeah. Yeah.
Bordering on me punching someone else.
So I'm happy to take questions or, have a conversation. Yeah.
Hi, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Your presentation was deeply moving and your research is really fascinating. My question is that I'm curious, as you were conducting these extensive interviews and doing all of this research, how do you view yourself as a researcher for an issue that is so complicated, rapidly developing, and emotional?
Yeah. Do we need to get that? Okay. So do you mean like when I was doing the work, or how do I think about that now in hindsight?
I think while you were doing the work, like how did you mentally go through these interviews when it's like very sensitive topics and whatnot?
Sure, that's a great question. I will take two more and then I'll answer all of them just to make sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, I had a question.
Yeah.
So we read your book as part of Christina's endings class last semester. And I think when I first started reading the book, I entered in when learning about like how people within Latino communities are preyed on from a really young age. Folks that haven't read it, it's very similar to like military sort of preying on youth of color and sort of this promise of like this is a route to like get into the middle class and sort of those tactics. And I started reading the book and I think went into that class post having read the book with sort of unsure how to make sense of like factoring in folks like limited life affordances when making the decision to go into border enforcement. And I was sort of ambivalent about like, should we try to understand them? Like, do we extend grace? Like how, to what extent should that reality be factored into the conversation of a very intentional lack of social safety net among these communities that like, for some people, it truly does feel like this is the only option. And so I think as I finished the book and now hearing about it again and being in the moment that we are, like my stomach quite literally hurts. Like I can't even imagine extending grace anymore.
Yeah.
I'm just like you are like actively instilling harm on people, and it's very explicit and very like clear, and it doesn't seem like there is room for any of that. So I don't know. I just wanted to hear any thoughts you might have like related to that dynamic and understanding, contextualizing sort of people's actions, but then also how do we like hold them accountable? And then second super quick question, also relatedly, like it seemed like these denial of responsibility and all these denial strategies, like people like appease any cognitive dissonance that they can be dealing with. So it's like, how do you get someone to want to resist when they are so secure and set in the behavior and actions that they're partaking in? Like they just are unable to see any harm. I think this is where I'm at. It's like, how do you get someone to see who doesn't want to see?
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, I'll take one more and then I'll answer all three of them. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi. I'm not a sociologist, so I don't know if this question is like the most relevant. But I am a literary studies scholar, and I was really interested in, I think, the very end of like your methodological section of your introduction, when you were talking about accounts as this kind of like serving this mediating function between like collective understandings of behavior and individual behavior. And I was just curious, like, how one goes about deciding what gets to count as an account for the purpose of the study. Specifically, since I think you also made the point, you also premised the point on like how the agents would read you as like a proxy for an audience that wasn't physically in the room. But I was just wondering like how you would go about deciding that, because I was really interested in that for my own work.
Sure, yeah. I love all of these questions. Thank you so much. I think I can kind of answer, I think they are all in the same realm, right? Which are about my positionality to this work in relation as a researcher, but also just as a person. And then also like, what do you get when you talk to power holders, right? And that's where the accounts come in. So I think I'm going to try to answer them together and maybe not in particular order. So let's see. As I talk about in the methodological appendix, we have about 30 minutes. Okay, I want to make sure I get enough questions. I am from the US-Mexico border, and the people that I interviewed, even though I didn't know anyone that was a border patrol agent or an ICE officer, I had moved away from the border years before, they were familiar to me. Because they were familiar in the way that if you're from the border, you're subject to the normalization of immigration enforcement. I also talk about in the appendix my own privilege, right? So I am a US born citizen, and my mother was a citizen. And so I didn't feel vulnerable to immigration agents in the way that someone who has a more precarious status felt, has literally trauma. And so all of that, I say that because I think that's relevant to how I, one, am able to do this work, and how I enter the field, and how I sit there across from people listening to these stories, right? So it's also important to note that the project that I did before this was I interviewed Mexican Americans who were members of anti-immigrant organizations, like the Minutemen or other organizations. So I had experience interviewing people who I disagreed with. And I also had this intellectual fascination with people who we might think of as negative cases on the question of like racial solidarity, right? And so I say all of that to say, when I'm talking to immigration agents, I had by then and during the course of this project developed a very specific way of interviewing and relating to them. Everything that we learn about how to do qualitative work and how to establish rapport with our respondents assume that we agree with our respondents. It assumes that we want to empower our respondents to tell our story. And so what that leads to is this very like empathetic, leaning in, almost like signaling agreement. Right? That's how we teach people to do qualitative interviews. I learned through the project that I did before that that didn't feel good to me. And so I didn't lean in. I tried to practice this like neutral outsider that was interested in what they were saying, but that wasn't going to agree and smile and go, oh yeah, well that makes total sense. Yeah, totally, yeah. Right. And what that does is, yeah, it creates a lot of difficulty, right? Because sometimes you hear something that's outrageous, or people make assumptions about you. There's a certain amount of courtesy stigma that accrues to researchers who study people that are unsympathetic informants, people that we don't like, right? So people are like, oh, wait, you like them? Wait, how, right? And so what I practiced was very neutral face, very structured probes that would allow them to continue talking, that I was signaling that I wanted to learn more about their perspective, but that was as neutral as I could be in terms of agreement, right? I didn't signal agreement. And when they asked me, what are you going to say? What are you going to write? Like, right, you agree? I would always say, I don't know what I'm going to write until I collect all the data and I code all the data, which is true, right? Now, if you've read the work of Kathleen Blee, who studied KKK, racist activists, there's another way that I could have done that. I could have said from the beginning, hey, I deeply disagree with you, and I want to still hear what you have to say. And the truth is, I didn't know that I could do that. And because my training in qualitative methods was rooted in what I just talked about, right? In the assumption of agreement. Right now, if I think about like how could that have been different, both in terms of the emotional landscape of doing this work, I think that maybe I would have had less access. I think that maybe they would have 90 agents wouldn't have talked to me. I think I maybe would have talked to fewer of them, and then they would have cut me off. Yeah. So I think the kind of neutral. I don't think I was ever an insider. They never thought that I was an insider. I never sought to be an insider, but I think that they treated me, to your point, as like an audience. And because of that, I was able to get to what, to the question about accounts, right? So accounts are basically justificatory narratives. I don't pretend that these accounts are reflective of what they actually do. And I'm very clear to say in the book, this is not a book about decision-making rationales or about the policy, about the implementation of a specific policy. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to see how do they make sense of what's happening to an audience that they either proxy as skeptical, maybe as friendly skepticism. Sometimes they were suspicious of me. I think a lot of them were suspicious of me. And maybe that's why they talked to me, because they wanted, oh, like she seems open. So let me just explain the way that it really is, or the way that we see it. Because if you see it from our perspective, then it makes total sense, right? And those are accounts. And I think that when, I'm happy to talk more about this methodologically, but the way that what you want to be aware of what your case is, right? You want to be aware of what, everybody in interviews presents a moral sense of self, right? But the instinct to justify is a lot higher for people engaged in certain things, right? So in the case of immigration enforcement agents, I can't pretend that what they told me wasn't a justificatory account. And I think kind of grappling with that reality and then seeing what else can I do through probes methodologically to get beyond that? Is the methodological task. Yeah. So I'm happy to talk about your specific case. Now, this takes me to the question about like grace, but also like resistance and compliance. So, you know, somebody once told me like that after reading my book, they didn't know who the bad guy was. And that it was one of the most, you know, in this case, it was, they were giving it to me as a compliment. And they were saying, you know, that's one of the brilliant parts of the book that you, when you read the book, you're like, wait, are the guys, are the, for this person, right? For other people are like, I know who the bad guy is. They were like, you know, are the agents the bad guys, or like is the system the bad guy, right? And they were saying like, I don't know who it is. How did you do that? And I was like, I first of all, I had no idea how I did that. But my effort was not to humanize. I didn't go into, that's a political project that I was not involved with. I did not write this book to humanize agents. I did not go in there with like this idea that like if we just understand how they do the work, we can maybe extend grace. That was not the thing. I really truly wanted to understand how they did the work, right? Kind of in conversation with the dirty work occupations, like how do you do it, right? How do you deal with stigma and do the work anyway? But what happens is that once you interview 90 immigration agents, do bureaucratic document analysis, and there is a certain level of understanding, right? In the way that Mario Small talks about understanding as empathy as understanding, not empathy as sympathy or agreement. So I experience understanding. I understand how they do the work. I understand that the military is basically leveraging a poverty draft on working class men of color and working class people in general. I understand that once in the military, there's a very clear pathway into policing professions. These are, and I understand that with the education gap that we have in this country, where only 20% of Latino men have a college degree, and this job is one of the best paying without a college degree. I understand all that. I get that. Now, whether I think the implication is grace is not the project that I'm involved with. For some people, that might be the extension. But for me, the question is like understanding that what is the solution? Well, this isn't where I started, but I think the solution is partly economic opportunity, right? If the only economic opportunity that working class people, especially men of color, if the biggest one that they have is the military and the border patrol and ICE, we have a bigger problem on our hands in these border towns. So I think part of the question, part of the answer is economics and like addressing the educational gap, which is not where I started off with this project. I truly thought that if we understood the immigration enforcement bureaucracy, like we would know how to change things. But that's not where I end up in the book. Okay, now to the question of resistance and compliance. I spent 10 years thinking about why do they comply? And this is the project. Now I'm thinking under what conditions do they resist, right? Given that we see all of the rationalizations that go into doing the job. And so I started a new project on looking at that question of resistance. And it's at the very beginning stages, but one of the things that we've found, and this is a comparative project in the Netherlands and in the US, is it really has a lot to do with like the likelihood that you have another job. Like I hate this job, but I'm gonna stay in it until I have another one. Some people, like I talked to an ICE attorney who quit, and he was like, in this very principled refusal kind of way, but he said, I was, you know, like, I guess I just left on the table a bunch of student loan forgiveness. And he said that was really hard for me, but I got this other higher paying job that's going to make it okay. He's like, I know a lot of ICE officers ICE lawyers who are still in the job waiting for their federal student loan forgiveness before they leave. So it's sort of like this, but there's these very principled, like, I'm leaving, but there's also the structure, right? And like, that's part of the story here too. So anywho, okay, I've said a lot. I'll take a few more questions. Yeah.
I'm just curious. When you showed, for example, that denial is elicited by kind of gender dynamics, right? Women tend and children tend to elicit these moments of denial.
Yeah.
I'm curious if like these patterns also, I guess, what sort of patterns appeared among like the men and women of the ICE agents that you were interviewing, because I imagine during this training there is a kind of almost ungendering that is taking place and kind of indoctrinating everyone into a particular ideology. Yet I can't help but wonder what sort of differences might exist between men and women in relating these stories to you.
Yeah.
So I was just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'll take two more. Yeah. I'll go, I think I went here, and then I'll take yours because why not? I'll just, and then I'll do them all in turn.
Yeah, thank you again so much. This was so incredibly fascinating. I think, you know, with this denial, again, it's like so hard to wrap my mind around the way that they're justifying this and rushing it off. And I understand, like, okay, a lot of it does come from like human just coping. You don't want to be the bad guy. That's just like in nature. We don't want to be the bad guy.
Yeah.
I'm wondering also, like, to what extent, like, what is the locker room talk going on here? Like, are they like saying to one another too, like comforting one another, like, oh, you know, oh, I had to separate this family today, da 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 da. Another agent goes, like, oh, no, don't worry about it. Like, it's out of your hands. I'm wondering, if any of the agencies spoke to kind of mentioned their own dynamic with their colleagues. What's the justification going on between one another? Are they like justifying to one another, comforting one another?
Absolutely.
It's like, you're
Yeah,
right.
that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, Professor Vega. Thank you very much for introducing us to your fascinating work. My name is Marcos, just as your border patrol agent. And I have two quick questions.
Yes.
I think they're big. The first one is, when we think about bureaucratic ideologies, this denial of harm, I don't know about anyone else, but for me, it's impossible not to think about all the work that was produced after the Holocaust, like Hannah Arendt's Icon in Jerusalem,
Of course.
or the work Ordinary Man by Browning. So my first question is, what were your intuitions in the beginning of this work? Which literature did you have in mind? Did these things change? How did they move when you met all these people?
Totally.
And the second question was, a few months ago, when it occurred, the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis, we saw from the part of the state this strategy of, let's say, the inversion of aggression.
Yes.
Like this body that was just trying to rush and save the situation was actually threatening.
Yes.
And for some communities, like Black communities in this country, this inversion of aggression, you know, they have been experiencing it for a long time. We saw it with Rodney King in 1991 in LA.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you think that this discourse is established, like this narrative? Why is it that we all look at the same scene or representation and we don't appear to see the same thing? You know, how is that there is no visual evidence? Well, what is the narrative and visual dimension that changes the framework of the scene? I don't know.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions. I'll take one more. Yeah.
Would you talk about in your methodology, what language you did your interviews in?
Do I talk English? Do I talk about that? Yeah.
When you did your interview, did you conduct them in Spanish or English or both?
English. The interviews were in English. Yeah. But I can talk about the Spanglish. I think that the question of language is important in relation to the Latino-ness of my sample and like the question of rapport and insider-outsider status. But yeah, the interviews are in English. Okay, gender, locker room talk, banality of evil, and language. absolutely, there's a gendered component. I think you're right to think about the training as an ungendering process, because this is a hyper or a regendering process, if you will. This is a hyper masculine occupation, and so the women, part of what the women in these agencies are doing is trying not to be different from the men, because to be different from the men is to be weaker than the men, right? And so there's all kinds of implications for the way that women in law enforcement do the work that are related to this dynamic. But in relation to the question of denial and the moral ambiguity, the women who told me stories, they also told me stories of women, children, and families. And what they did that was an additional to the denial strategies was tell me very specific things of the kind of care work that they did or were expected to do or wanted to do. So for example, women not only had the same very similar strategies, but they also did extra things. So they would take care of the kids, they would go check on the women, they would do hygiene things that the men wouldn't do. And I think part of what that shows is both like a tension between them not wanting to be different and sometimes like really resenting that they were expected to, or that they felt the need to do this kind of care work, but also feeling like, well, but that's just, I couldn't not do it. Like the little girl just kept looking at me and like asked me if I could take her home. And how do I not do the things that I can do within the context of this, right? So there's like the gendered lives of immigration agents are very different in relation to moral ambiguity, and in the fact that these moral ambiguities mostly have to do with women, children, and family. So absolutely, that's a really good one. The locker room talk, you know, one of the interesting things, we know that the way that culture gets produced and reproduced in general is through stories, right? But definitely in policing, in policing culture, war stories have a really big role to play in the way that agents or officers make sense of their work. And one of it was, yes, they are telling each other these stories. And that's why I say these aren't just idiosyncratic, they kind of scale up as lessons for everybody. So one story, for example, that an agent told me, there was a story of a man who was arrested by the Border Patrol, who this man was very indigent and very docile, right? Not threatening at all, older. And the agent who arrested him felt really bad for him and gave him his food and his water. And this arrest made him question the entire enterprise. And then when the old man went to be processed in the processing unit, his fingerprints were put into the system, and it turned out that he had a record for sexual abuse of a minor, and that he had been deported for this, and that he was coming back. Now, this story, the lesson of this story is you never know who these people are. Even if you feel bad for them, you still have to do your job, because the only way to know who they really are is through fingerprinting them. And guess what? Anyone can be a criminal, the worst kind of criminal, even if they're old and docile, right? That's the lesson of the story. This story was told to me multiple times by different agents, but they said, this happened to my friend. This happened to this happened to that. And then then I ultimately interviewed the guy who was like, this happened to me, right? I was like, oh, wow, you're the, but it just goes to show these stories circulate among agents, and so too do the lessons behind them, right? And that's culture, but that's also policing culture and war stories, right? So absolutely, the locker room talk, as you put it, is like, it's like the lesson behind, like, oh, I know it sucks. I know this is like, it feels bad, but look, look at what happened to me, or look at what happened to this person, right? And then they're like, oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, you do never really know, right? So absolutely. Banality of evil, yes, all of that. So when I started this project, I went out into the field thinking that this project would be a study of immigration federalism. I was like, oh, I wanted to understand how state level context impacted the decisions that street level bureaucrats made on the ground. That's why I chose Arizona and California, because they were local contexts, very different political positionalities, posture vis-a-vis immigration policy. Of course, what happens once you get out in the field, don't worry for the graduate students in the room, this is normal, that you realize that either you really can't get to the thing that you thought you were gonna do, or there's something else that becomes much more interesting. And so I became much more interested in their accounts, their justificatory narratives, their normalization, but that's not where I started. And so to your question, absolutely. When I started this, my dissertation proposal that I defended was actually a study about, immigration federalism. And where I end up in the book is some combination of trying to bring in that literature on the sociology of denial, street level bureaucracy, these like emotional labor in bureaucracies. And because of the empirical patterns that I was seeing. But I think that if I had started the project with this in mind, my interview protocol would be very different, first of all. But also, I would have probably been more in conversation with, like, Stanford prison experiment, that kind of work. Where I end up is like, yes, I'm in conversation with the literature that looks at how people, state agents commit war crimes, for example, right? This project has something to do with those projects, but I'm really interested in not like framing agents as apathetic or just following the rules, but in really understanding the process by which they do that, and really like the negotiations that they go after, that they employ in order to do that, and also thinking about the racial aspects, right? The fact that most of these agents look like the people that they're implementing policies on is another part of the project. So absolutely, where I ended up is different from where I started, but definitely in conversation. Briefly to your question about how can we all see the same thing and come up with different, I think this is a question more, I'd be interested in for political scientists in the room, how this happens, right? Because I think part of it is like your own positionality, the way that your politics are in relation to immigration, for sure. But I think in relation to this project, that's just statecraft, right? The fact that the government comes out and calls Renee Good and Alex Preddy domestic terrorists within hours of their shooting, that's statecraft. And in fact, that's denial of the victim strategy. And you can see that that's like the state response, the official strategy. And that's just basic, like delegitimizing the opponent, right? That's statecraft to me. To the question of language, all of the respondents were either US, many of them were, the majority of were US born, spoke English. There were first generation immigrants, but also spoke English, of course, to do this job, right? Were citizens. So all of my interviews were in English, but where I think the language piece is interesting is that there was also some Spanglish in it during the interview, certainly, as someone who's from the border, like the Spanglish that the agents from the border spoke was very familiar to me. They sounded like people I had grown up with. They sounded like me, if you ever get me in a Spanglish room. And so I think that helped gain access to a certain extent, or to maintain access, because I think they were kind of confused by me. They were like, okay, wait, so she's from here, but she's at UCLA, which is super liberal. So we know she doesn't like us. but she also sounds a little bit like us, so maybe she likes us. And so language was an interesting part of this. But the interviews themselves and all of the nitty gritty of the project were in English. Yeah. There's only 1 minute left. Yeah.
This is granted I missed your talk. I just heard the question part, but I was just thinking about Goffman and your frame analysis. I just wondered how you did or did not.
How much time do we have for a Goffman question? We have this, yeah.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Oh, okay.
Okay.
If anyone needs to leave, please don't let me keep you behind. I think that part of it is, I didn't do a Goffmanian analysis, like a frame analysis, if you will. That wasn't my approach, but I definitely think that part of this is Goffmanian, right? It's like in terms of stigma management, for example. Like in the last chapter of the book on stigma, it's very much in conversation with Goffman and in how we conceal what we reveal when we do. But I was much more thinking about that in the context of bureaucracies and of dirty work occupations, and all of the legitimation that occurs when you're a part of a particular occupation. So I think that there's a lot of Goffman here, but it wasn't the main frame that I used.
It's good. Round of applause.